I'm Mimi Rosenberg, and this is Equal Rights and Justice, where we educate, agitate, and organize to empower we the people, and for an egalitarian society, for another world is possible, and we are surely the ones who can make it so. We're joined now by one of the most prolific authors, historians, and griots of Black freedom struggles and the contributions of people of African ancestry to world development and struggles and successes of working people alive today, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne, whose continual archaeological exploration into Black history and his unearthing of the Black experience across the diaspora and in the U.S., always with a forensic analysis of the intersectionality of race and class and truth-telling that debunks the myths created by bourgeois democracy. Yes, Dr. Horne exposes the myth of American exceptionalism, exposing America's settler colonialist origins and its genocide of the indigenous population, and then reveals not the democratic origins of America, but the brutal economic system of plantation capitalism, an economy built on slavery and then later on wage slavery. He does so to educate and agitate and organize from the past to the present to build a new tomorrow. Professor Horne, author of some 35 books, joins us now to discuss his latest work, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. It is always a great pleasure and honor to have you with us, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, for me, the 60s and 70s period of the upsurge of organizations like the Black Panther Party, which seemed to meld the practice of working with the masses, providing them with a service and political education to really look towards the assumption of state power, and an organization that was informed by, throughout the world at that period, anti-colonialist struggles that gave instruction to educate, agitate, and to organize here as part of the liberation struggle. And the liberation struggle, I think the Panthers understood, was against capitalism. I'm wondering if that is what provoked or evoked for you this particular period of study and to unearth and to bring to us in your work, Armed Struggle. What was it that you thought was so strategic about this period and groups like the Black Panther Party? And they are by no means the only organization from the liberatory process that you study in this opus, Armed Struggle.
Well, you may recall that I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area some decades ago in order to attend law school, and I became involved with the Black Panther Party and became involved with many folks who were oriented within their orbit. For example, I taught at a so-called correctional facility in the Golden State in Vacaville, just north of Berkeley, where I was enrolled in school. And one of my students was a man then known as Donald DeFreeze, who you may recall,
yes,
ultimately went up in flames after he became involved in a shootout with the LAPD some years ago as a result of his affiliation with the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army. And in fact, I had lent him my prized copy of Frederick Ingalls, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which I never got back, needless to say, which was a cautionary note in terms of lending out books. So this particular book we have before us is not only a product of research, but it also has a kind of memoir embedded in it, since I was involved, albeit peripherally, in some of the activities that I write about.
Well, one of the other things, and we're going to open up shortly with you reading a passage to set the flavor and the tone, as well as give people a sense of the writing. The melding of from revolutionary nationalist to an anti-capitalist perspective, the inclusion of many of the principles of the Communist Party of that era with the revolutionary nationalist sentiments and the like, for me, we're beginning to create a whole picture that gave a robust understanding of the society and truly were a way of breaking away from reformism to a revolutionary struggle that would really implement equal rights and justice, the move towards an egalitarian society. Was that also part of your trajectory in choosing the groups that you look at and what was coming together, coalescing in this period, really from the 70s back through to the 30s?
Well, as your previous comment suggests, this book not only deals with the Panthers in Southern California from about the mid-1960s through the late 1970s, it also deals with the Southern California Communist Party from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 over that same time period. And I should say, parenthetically, that it deals with the NAACP during that same particular period, because they were a kind of counterpoint to those two previously aforementioned organizations, not to mention dealing with various other trends of Black nationalism, not least the US organization led by a man still in the land of the living, speaking of Maulana Karenga, perhaps best known to your audience as a person who helped to devise the celebration, if you like, in late December of every year, early January, of Kwanzaa. I should say that this book also tries to reframe this concept of Black power, because oftentimes, if you look at the current histories of, quote, Black power, unquote, you'll find that certain antagonists are basically grouped together, which would have been rather disappointing to both sides. Going back to their origins. What I'm talking about is that you may know that in this book, there is a pivotal turning point in 1969 when there's a shootout on the UCLA campus between the Panthers and certain members of the US organization. Now, some in your audience might find it curious that those folks who were shooting at each other are basically grouped together. And as an earlier comment by yourself suggests, the Panthers were deeply influenced by the science of society, by socialism, by communism. Jonathan Jackson, who is a leading figure in this book, recalled that it was in August 1970 that this precocious teenager with roots in Pasadena entered a courthouse in Marin County, California, north of San Francisco, and helped to liberate a number of prisoners who were then on trial. But in a subsequent shootout, he and a couple of prisoners, in addition to the judge, were killed. Now, Jonathan Jackson, as a high schooler, edited a newspaper called Iskra, homage to a publication of the same name that was published by Bolsheviks in Russia. The Panthers were quite taken with the Marxist Russian philosopher Plekhanov. Now, many of the historians who are writing about the Panthers today are not necessarily familiar with Plekhanov, not necessarily familiar with Iskra. Perhaps this is not just a matter of not being aware of certain philosophical discourses, but perhaps it's also a reflection of the Cold War. That is to say, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a kind of ideological victory or advance, if you like, by imperialists, which has tended to obscure, if not obliterate, some of the advances and some of the discourses that the Panthers and other black radicals and black revolutionaries were involved in. What I'm seeking to do is restore a more accurate picture of what went down, because as we face, according to some, the hot breath of fascism breathing down our necks, the fact that a member of the Heritage Foundation, with regard to this so-called Project 2025 that's been put out, suggested that it was a bloodless, quote unquote, revolution that was being planned if the left would allow it to be so, he says. And what I'm trying to do in this book is tell an accurate and comprehensive story about this question of armed struggle, and also what to avoid if we have to go down that road in the future because of this hot breath of fascism breathing down our necks. I should also say that for those who might be chastened by that previous comment, keep in mind that this territory on which we now stand was taken by force of arms from the Native Americans, that Africans were enslaved by dint of a barrel of a gun. And we also know that there was historic resistance, be it Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia, John Brown, 1859 in what is now West Virginia, seeking to overthrow slavery. I talk about the fact that in Moscow in the 1930s, you had U.S. communists being trained in various techniques of armed struggle, albeit because they were going to be deployed to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War by 1936. We also know, of course, that the Panthers themselves were inspired by the Cuban Revolution, armed struggle, the armed struggle unfolding in Southern Africa, armed struggle unfolding in Indochina, the Chinese Revolution, etc. So despite the fact that there are those who suggest that armed struggle has been passé and has not accomplished anything of note, they need look no further than the stars and stripes floating high above many buildings in this country in order to refute that particular nostrum.
I must just add, which may be a little bit out of sync to our discussion, but fresh back from tens of thousands of people, largely unreported in the media, that were in Washington, D.C. yesterday to protest the enormous affront to any democracy and democratic aspiration of Netanyahu's coming in and addressing the Congress. And one of the very glorious moments, I must say, symbolic, but oh, how symbolic, was that groups of young activists in front of Union Station took the flagpoles, and brought down the American flag and then raised up the Palestinian flag in its stead. And symbolic, oh, absolutely, but it was just a glorious moment to know that it could happen. And the reason it was so glorious was the heart and soul that goes into the inspiration and the hope and the possibility that can go into people engaged in the freedom struggle, which in this instance was symbolized by the raising of a free Palestine, the Palestinian flag, in place of the U.S. flag, which has been a perpetrator historically of genocide and because settler colonialism, on which we were founded, equals genocide. So you just evoke that for me. So I think these things are very important. But to move forward in this, one of the things that was most significant to me in the book, even though the groups didn't come together, sadly, in many ways, but was the flowing by virtue of, to some extent, maybe because of people like Angela Davis and George Jackson, but the flowing of communist, of anti-capitalist ideology and the knowledge that there must be a transference of power to the people from the plutocracy in terms of capitalism. And that flowed through and began to inform the Panthers, but all really of the revolutionary nationalist groups that were operating in Southern California at that period. So is that some of your understanding and some of the takeaway in the role of people like Angela and George Jackson in kind of melding revolutionary nationalism with an anti-capitalist understanding of state power?
Well, certainly the Panthers themselves, and many also within the socialist black communist orbit, consider themselves to be the children of Malcolm X ideologically, and therefore consider themselves to be revolutionary nationalists, to use the phrase that you just introduced. But I should also say that in some ways, implicitly, the folks that I'm talking about in this book, particularly the Panthers, they had an implicit refutation of certain ideas that are still current. I mean, for example, despite an enormous advance in terms of historiography of the United States, you still have many of our friends on the left who consider 1776 to have been a great leap forward for humanity, even though the number of enslaved increased from the thousands in 1776 to the millions by 1860, 1861, when the Civil War erupted, despite the fact that the settlers were along the Atlantic seaboard in 1776, but by 1861 had moved across the continent, liquidating independent Native American nations in their wake. And that somehow this genocide is seen as being part of a great leap forward for humanity. Now, unfortunately, many of those who consider themselves to be the scientists of society in the 1960s had not advanced, perhaps understandably, to the kind of understandings that we have at this precise moment of the history of settler colonialism. That term you introduced was not necessarily current in the 1960s, and it's not necessarily even current today in North America, although people apply it to historic Palestine, apply it to Southern Africa, etc. And that's part of the ideological weakness of the U.S. left that we're still grappling with. I should also mention that 1776 is oftentimes grouped with the French Revolution, 1789, even though, per C.L.R. James, the late Trinidadian intellectual in his book Black Jacobins, there was an organic connection between the French Revolution of 1789 and the igniting of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which led to a general crisis of the entire slave system that can only be resolved with this collapse. And we should draw reasonable inferences from the fact that today, at this precise moment in France, you had a parliamentary election where gaining the most votes were a coalition of communists, socialists, Greens, and a group led by former Trotskyists, speaking of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, his France Unbowed. And of course, they're now pushing to have the prime minister come from their ranks. Well, we should draw inferences from the fact that that is the fruit of the French Revolution, whereas in the United States, which supposedly is grouped with France in this so-called age of revolution, as noted, we're staring down the barrel of a possible fascism. Now, once again, I think that many of our intellectuals in this country have done a fair to middling job in terms of rewriting the history of this country, but it hasn't necessarily been absorbed by many of the activists, many of the self-styled, self-proclaimed revolutionaries. Even within the temple that is law school, you have a slashing critique of the U.S. Constitution, which many liberals, and in fact, many who consider themselves to be left of liberal, have considered to be a saving grace of the United States of America. But yet, at Harvard Law School, you have Michael Klarman, who's written about the Constitution under the title The Framers' Coup, Noah Feldman, The Broken Constitution, Boston College of Law, Aziz Rana, The Constitutional Bind, Mary Ellen Franks of George Washington, The Constitutional Cult, for example. And so within the temple itself, you have this critique, but it has not necessarily been absorbed for whatever reason by, once again, the activist community. And I should also mention in this regard that our Cuban friends have tried to point us in certain directions that many have chosen to ignore. I'm thinking of the late, great Cuban revolutionary Blas Roca, who in 1960 pondered a question that is yet to be absorbed altogether in this country. He says, why in this hemisphere in 1960 are black people treated worse than black people in any other country in this hemisphere? And that was likely true in 1960, for example. What we now know, of course, is that part of the reason is that 1776 led to a great leap forward for enslavement of Africans. Africans had the good sense not to engage in class collaboration and participate in their own demise. We now know that some of the rituals that were visited upon black people, I'm thinking of these lynching carnivals, that even overseas, when I was living in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, the European minority there would shake their heads in wonder as to why you had these lynching carnivals that took place. And so the Panthers, in some ways, were absorbing implicitly some of these historical lessons that I've just articulated. And unfortunately, they did not necessarily absorb these lessons altogether, perhaps understandably. That is to say that because there was a certain naivete about the founding of the United States, supposedly founding on this great and grand revolution, there was not necessarily an analysis of the battlefield, an analysis of the forces on the ground who would necessarily be involved in the revolutionary process. Certainly, it was fair to suggest that black people were unwilling to live in the old way and wanted to live in a new way. And the Panthers styled themselves as the vanguard who were going to lead them in that direction. The question was, and still is to a certain degree, what about the millions of other people, particularly in the class of settlers, who were not so inclined? how were we to deal with them? And that is a remaining question as we speak.
We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the author, his newest work, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. And I'm Mimi Rosenberg. This is, of course, Equal Rights and Justice. Gerald, I wonder if you would be kind enough to read a passage just to also give people a sense of the flavor, the tone of the book itself, which is a must-read and a must-have. Armed Struggle, Dr. Gerald Horne. And the reason for that is because it is biting off a humongous chunk of some of the most progressive and meaningful history towards equal rights and justice, towards any kind of freedom for the peoples of this country, and particularly its most oppressed sectors, who also have generally been the forefront of the freedom struggle on which every one of us have built our subsequent liberatory efforts, women and gay rights and the like, and indeed the working class movement built on the struggles since the inception of the liberatory freedom aspirations and the liberation road followed by people of African ancestry. So can you give us a passage to further whet our appetite to delve deep into this incredibly informative book?
Well, this is the opening paragraph that opens the book. It was June 1971 in Algiers, the intriguing Mediterranean city in North Africa featuring a plethora of whitewashed buildings, then the site of the major international legation of the Black Panther Party headquartered in California. It was in Algeria where party leaders Kathleen Neal Cleaver and Donald Cox were to be found conferring with a diplomat from the embassy of then socialist Czechoslovakia. The readout was explicit. The U.S. militants were seeking a cache of, quote, Model 61 automatic machine pistols, ideally suited to the conditions of our struggle in the urban areas, unquote. Also desired were, quote, silencers, unquote. These Panthers had been, quote, informed, unquote, that the diplomats, quote, government supported the liberation struggle of all peoples, unquote. So why not back those in the citadel of imperialism? They were told, quote, they would do whatever they could to aid us, unquote. Fellow exiled Panther Pete O'Neill, originally of Kansas City, Missouri, now in exile in Tanzania, Southeast Africa, recalled that, quote, the North Vietnamese embassy, unquote, in Algiers also, quote, gave us money and some guns, unquote. Now, the source for that Cleaver-Cox meeting with the diplomat from Prague is the Eldridge Cleaver Archive at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. There's another Cleaver Archive in Berkeley at the University of California. Also, in a textual footnote, the first footnote of the book, a quote, Panther leader Elaine Brown, still in the land of the living, who says in her memoir that, quote, in the vicinity of Oakland, her organization had, quote, literally thousands of weapons, large numbers of AR-18 and AR-18 short automatic rifles, 308 scope rifles, 30-30 Winchesters, 375 Magnum, 30 caliber Garand, M15s and M16 submachine guns, M59 Santa Fe troopers, anti-tank guns, innumerable shotguns, grenade launchers, suitcases, trunk loads, closets full of pistols, boxes and boxes of ammunition, crossbows and arrows, grenades, unquote. Now, listeners should reasonably infer that this was a product of this Second Amendment that we hear so much about in the United States, the proliferation of weapons. And I should also add quickly that meaningful steps towards gun control were taken during this period precisely because the Black Panthers had armed themselves so notoriously. And I should also say what I say in the opening pages of this work, that with regard to armed struggle, the question is not necessarily in a country like the United States gaining access to arms. The question is having an analysis of the forces on the ground, of the correlation of forces, both domestically and globally, that would allow one to prevail.
Now, that's a rough one, because one of the realities of this country is that there are periods, whether we look at the period of Jim Crow, which really followed the most pronounced aggressive period of lynching, which Ida B. Wells addressed. There's the issue of revolutionary self-defense and actually feeling that you are at the stage historically of being able to assume state power and no other means for doing that but arms, and whether this is the right period. Break down for us some of your thoughts and concerns that cause you to name the book Armed Struggle and do that analysis, because that certainly has been an issue of tremendous concern and often created a discourse subsequent to the fact that the precipitous use of arms or misunderstanding the revolutionary period that we were in led to the demise of the very organizations that were righteously trying to struggle for the freedom of their peoples and the society. So how are we to really kind of analyze and look at, in the context of this country and the Black freedom struggles, the issue of armed struggle?
Well, first of all, you should draw an analytical distinction between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. With regard to armed propaganda, that was exemplified in May 1967 when the newly minted Panthers marched into the state legislative assembly in Sacramento, California, in protest against certain proposed measures that would circumscribe their ability to have access to weapons. In South Africa, of course, armed propaganda included bombing certain kinds of facilities where civilian bloodshed was not at issue. Armed self-defense, of course, is seen by many as just intelligent. That is to say, the Panthers arose out of this concern with police running amok. And I should mention, before we go a step further, that it's no accident that this book is cited in Southern California, the headquarters of the notorious Los Angeles Police Department, who have a reputation for shooting first, asking questions later, who during a siege of the Black Panther headquarters in Los Angeles in December 1969 contemplated bringing forward tanks from a U.S. military base just south of Los Angeles, just north of San Diego, for example. And then, of course, there's armed struggle, which is exemplified by the aforementioned story of the precocious Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson and his attempt to free certain prisoners, or at least minimally draw attention to what was going on in prisons, particularly the kinds of torturous conditions that were afflicting his older brother, speaking of George Jackson. Once again, it's difficult to understand how slavery began to decompose without understanding the fact that Abraham Lincoln had the vision and foresight to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, which was a war-fighting measure, which allowed for the recruitment of 200,000 black men to fight with arms in hand to destroy the hated, despised system of slavery. You cannot begin to understand the retreat of Jim Crow some decades ago without understanding national liberation struggles, particularly in Africa, and how with African nations coming to independence and presiding over the great storehouse of natural resources, U.S. imperialism felt that it was in their best interest to appeal to hearts and minds in these liberated territories by easing the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow U.S. apartheid on these shores. So once again, even though understandably on these shores, there is an emphasis on the strategy of philosophical nonviolence as embodied by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under Dr. King. But I think it would be a historical error to assume that that was the exclusive approach that led to that significant victory.
The book deals in considerable depth with the differentiation between what you just talked about in a cursory way, armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle, and placing them in a global context of anti-war activism, the Cold War, and African liberation. Flesh it out for us further. I mean, and talk about where you think, certainly we have groups like the Black Liberation Army, the African American Liberation Army, and groups like the Black Guerrilla Family that evolved, and their use, and where are we to place that in the context of your earlier statements, if you will, that we are on the precipice of a kind of galloping fascism, and what that means for the very existence and perseverance or preservation, we should say, of people of African ancestry, of immigrants, of indigenous people that have already been oppressed. I mean, how are we to understand the phenomena and where it fits into the context today of people who are getting slaughtered still by police, a fearful and frightening, unified Republican Party hell-bent on introducing some of the most repressive political and structural removals of any kind of facade of bourgeois democracy. So, you know, bring it together for us in terms of what you think we've learned then for now, and how are we more fully to grapple with that distinction of armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle?
Well, first of all, with regard to fascism, there are those who do not consider themselves to be radical or revolutionary who have warned the populace of the United States about the prospect of fascism. I'm thinking of the late U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Her final book was called Fascism: A Warning. I'm thinking of a book I just wrote a review essay about that you can find online. The book is called Illiberalism: A History. Where the question of fascism is rooted. I should also say that if you do a close and careful study of the United States of America, you should not be surprised by the fact that we may be facing this dire and dismal prospect. After all, we've lived through genocide, at least our ancestors did. We've lived through mass enslavement. We also recognize that the aforementioned settler colonialism has been based upon class collaboration between and amongst settlers of European descent that goes back to the 1580s when England sent colonists across the Atlantic to what they call North Carolina. That's talked about in my book on the 16th century. And you cannot begin to understand January 6, 2021, not to mention Mr. Trump getting 75 million votes in November 2020, not to mention the Republican convention, not to mention the prospect of his returning to power in January, without understanding class collaboration. And that's something that has not necessarily been analyzed the way it should have been analyzed or could have been analyzed by those who were really serious about a radical transformation in this country. So once again, I think that before we go further, I should introduce some of the more hopeful signs that we espy on the landscape. The protests that you just mentioned in Washington, D.C. yesterday, for example, against the war criminal Netanyahu, the fact that many unions have come out in favor of a ceasefire with regard to the ongoing genocide in historic Palestine, the fact that a number of leaders of the Democratic Party, including Senator Sanders, found it useful to boycott the remarks of Mr. Netanyahu, etc. So it's far from being a foregone conclusion that we will be facing fascism. It's far from being a foregone conclusion that the Heritage Foundation will accomplish their ghoulish and ghastly goal of somehow forcing down our throats a counter-revolution that would inevitably involve bloodshed. But on the other hand, we would be foolish and simple-minded to act as if there is a smooth road ahead without any obstacles. And we should be prepared for various kinds of eventualities. And to that end, one of the reasons I wrote this book is to instruct upcoming generations that if they decide to follow the path that the Panthers, or at least many Panthers and, as you noted, affiliated groups like the Black Liberation Army decided to pursue, they may want to draw upon certain lessons that should have been more closely observed. For example, if you're going to work with the Cubans in this regard, you should be respectful of their sovereignty. If you're going to be working with the Algerians and other comrades overseas, you should be respectful of their sovereignty. And once again, to reiterate the major point, you should have an analysis of the constellation of forces on the ground in the United States, not to mention globally, because as I say in the book, there were those who were friendly to the Panthers who suggested that armed struggle in the United States should only be taken up if you are on the verge of seizing power, not necessarily in any other context. Perhaps there are those who disagree with that, but perhaps in dissecting their disagreement, they could do a comparative analysis of other struggles involving armed struggle along the lines that I've attempted in this book.
Well, one of the great contributions of this book is a reminder to us of I think it's a corrective to a lot of the ways that people on the left look at the black freedom struggles as though they were entirely of a nationalist, albeit a revolutionary nationalist perspective, but didn't have an analysis and were not tilting at state power and the dismantling of the capitalist system. and the coming together here and the different influences which you demonstrate so demonstratively, whether it's from individuals like Angela Davis, from the Communist Party, which was her background and brought to the Black Panther individuals, certainly people like George Jackson and the like, but there's the anti-colonialist struggles and the struggles of the Kwame Nkrumah and the like, all were part of what was melding with the particular unique form of freedom struggles of people of African American heritage and ancestry here. And I wonder if you can just kind of bring that together and the robustness, actually, that I think you demonstrate of that analysis as it went into thinking about issues of state power. Perhaps the thorn in all that is where armed struggle fits in, and whether this was politically the right period and so on. But I think the contribution of understanding that these were not just isolated struggles that negated each other, but that there really was an ebb and flow internationally and from the communist movement to the nationalist movement of an understanding most imperative of state power and the dismantling of capitalism.
Well, with regard to the latter, one of the key figures in this book, and a man who I wrote an entire biography about, is William L. Patterson, who led the struggle on behalf of the Scottsboro Nine, the 9 black youth in Alabama, being railroaded to execution on spurious and specious grounds of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women. He had considerable international experience being in and out of Hamburg, Germany in the 1930s. During the height of the anti-Nazi struggle, he was a leader of the campaign to free Angela Davis. Recall that it was Angela Davis who was a result of the aforementioned August 1970 action at the Marin County Courthouse, was being charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, and it required an international movement that Patterson helped to captain that led to her freedom and led to a great leap forward for revolutionary struggle in this country. But it's not just Patterson. There's Cyril Briggs, who certain veterans might recall had roots in the Caribbean and Nevis. One of like the stories.
I'm the program host and executive producer across the city. Not to say there should be no change in their neighborhoods, but they should have an equitable say in how...
What? Hi, I'm sorry for that interruption. A little glitch in our technological system. I'm sorry, Gerald.
Oh, sure. So Cyril Briggs, so you might recall that during the World War I era, he helped to organize the African Blood Brotherhood, which in some ways was a precursor of the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party, which Angela Davis and her comrades were part of in 1960s Los Angeles. And I'm still taken aback by this point that some of our friends on the left somehow are unaware and ignorant of this revolutionary action and potential in the black community, the studying of the classics, revolutionary struggles, the reaching out across the oceans and across the borders to revolutionaries in other countries, seeking to learn from their experience. But now let me turn the coin over, and in our remaining seconds, mention that this book also deals with the NAACP, which in some ways has been a disappointment, organized in 1909, not least by W.E.B. Du Bois, a father of Pan-Africanism, who eventually joins the Communist Party himself in 1961, but is compelled, speaking of the NAACP, to imbibe the bitter poison of anti-communism, purges the Communist Party, from its ranks in the 1950s. One of the leaders in California in that regard was Franklin Williams, who then goes on to become U.S. ambassador to Ghana and has a still unacknowledged role in the dislodging of Kwame Nkrumah in February 1966. Taking back and reintroducing the revolutionary potential of that mass organization still should be seen, seems to me, as a leading priority in this country if we are to be successful in beating back the fascist attack. And I should also mention, once again, that it's no accident that this book is cited predominantly in the Golden State, not only because of the fact that oftentimes well-heeled actors and directors and screenplay writers were significant financial donors to revolutionary struggles, but also you have due north, the presence headquartered of the Longshore Union, International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which should be contrasted with the ILA, the International Longshore Association of the East Coast. The former dominated by Reds, including Harry Bridges, who was well born in Melbourne, Australia, and the United States tried to deport him more than once on the grounds that he was supposedly a leading communist, as opposed to the gangsters who oftentimes were in control of the ILA, as represented in that Marlon Brando movie on the waterfront. And so you also had the student struggles at University of California at Berkeley, the free speech movement. You had the struggle for Black studies, an essential component of this entire revolutionary upsurge at San Francisco State University, which bequeathed to us a man still in the land of the living at the age of 78, speaking of Danny Glover, the great actor and producer. So this book has many different strands and many different facets. But once again, one of the points that I'm trying to make is to reacquaint those who may have been forgotten or were not aware, reacquaint them with this history, and also point out some of the pitfalls that we should avoid if we have to go down this road once again.
Well, I am going to take advantage of the last couple of moments to ask you a question to take it full on to where we are today. You referenced the 2025 heritage-oriented, contributed to project agenda in preparation for a Trumpian administration, which is a absolutely fascistic document. The project is terrifying. But your final thoughts, really, as we tell people to prepare for today, to read Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Your thought about what this period does portend. You referenced it somewhat during this discourse, but now with perhaps the resignation of stepping down of President Biden, your thoughts on what we have to be particularly attentive to as we try to prevent the advent of a full-on structural form of fascism in this country.
Well, first of all, just to reiterate something that may have been implicit in what I've been saying for the past few minutes, is that we need deeper analyses. I mean, for example, we should not assume that when a Sonia Massey is shot in the face by a Chicago Police Department or Eric Garner is suffocated on the streets of Staten Island, that these are somehow accidents. We should see them as flowing inevitably and inexorably from not only settler colonialism, but the intentionality of anti-Blackness and the, of course, perniciousness of the after effects of slavery, which were baked into the cake in 1776. And we need that sort of analysis. Second of all, with regard to this upcoming election, just to state the obvious of Civics 101, and I make this point actually in the book, that the United States is a federal system, just like the European Union is a federal body, and therefore you don't necessarily expect the politics of France to be the same as the politics of Hungary. Likewise, we need to see the different politics involved in different states, and so therefore I reside in the state of Texas. I don't think I'm talking out of school or making a wild prognostication to suggest that the Republicans, as they have for 30 years, will likely prevail in the Lone Star State, which means that it's incumbent upon us there to build left alternatives in that particular state. And of course, we already know that in 43 of the 50 states, we already know what the result is going to be. There are only about 7 or 8 so-called swing states where there is contention. And so we should take advantage of this electoral college, which suggests that the United States is not one solitary, unitary body, but is 50 different bodies with 50 different elections. And it's not incumbent upon those in the state of Texas to vote the same way as those who vote in the state of California, or, for example, those who vote in a swing state like North Carolina. Now, this should be obvious, but the fact that I have to reiterate it, take precious airtime to do so, suggests once again the kind of ideological spade work that is yet to be done in this country.
Well, more words of wisdom from our griot, our gem, a national treasure, Dr. Gerald Horne, who gave us some of the takeaways from armed struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s, all